If you've been to downtown historic Baraboo, you know we have a lot of wonderful brick buildings from the late 1800s. And these are the result often of fires that cleared the blocks for these new buildings. Most of them are second generation buildings, replacing earlier wooden structures, and that's what we want to talk about tonight. So they date from the early 1870s to around the late 1880s. 1886 was a seminal year for building. So tonight we want to talk about six major fires in downtown Baraboo between 1871 and 1886. And we have a wonderful map to start off with, the 1870 bird's eye map of Baraboo, showing a small sleepy village along the banks of the Baraboo River. Fortunately for us in our story, this map was drawn just the year before the major fires started. Because there was no railroad yet in Baraboo, there were very few brick buildings, and two of them that were there are shown on the bottom of this map. The bottom left is the brick courthouse in Sauk County, the pride of the county, and on the right bottom is the 1869 Baraboo High School, which was the pride of the city of Baraboo. It was very hard to get bricks to Baraboo, so most of them had to be made locally. If we zoom in on the square now from 1870, you can see in the middle of the square the brick courthouse, which we'll talk about tonight. And around the square, there's really only about two other buildings that are built of brick during this time period. The rest are all wooden buildings, and most of these we will talk about tonight going up in flames. There were six major fires starting in 1871, then in 1872, 1878, 1880, 1884, and 1886. So those are the six we'll talk about tonight, but I'm going to throw in a couple of bonus fires. These six fires here resulted in large numbers of brick buildings being built, but before 1871 there were a couple fires. 1859 on the north side of the square, but that did not result in any brick buildings, and 1867 on the south side of the square, which did result in one brick building, which we'll talk about. Before we do that, though, I want to show you the oldest known picture of downtown Baraboo. This is the Ohio store run by J.R. Davis on Oak Street. This is about where Nito's Bakery sits today in downtown Baraboo. This picture was probably taken in the late 1850s, and it almost looks like Abraham Lincoln is standing there on the back behind the wagon. But it just shows you the wooden buildings that were downtown, and the dirt streets, and also even the sidewalks, if you notice, were built of wood, or boardwalks as they were called, because they were made of boards. So lots of flammable material in downtown Baraboo. That building, the Ohio store, is shown on this map, the 1870 map, along Oak Street there. But we want to talk first about the 1859 fire, which happened on the north side of the square. And it happened on a particular day in July when a lot of fires happened in Baraboo, and that was the day after Independence Day, so July 5th. So on the north side of the square was Sauk County's second courthouse, the wooden courthouse that was built in 1847 after the county seat was moved from Prairie to Sac. This sat about where the Square Tavern sits today on the north side of the square. And of course, it was a wooden structure. It was kind of a temporary building. They built it on the north side of the square, realizing that eventually they would build a proper brick courthouse in the center of the square, which they did in 1855 to 1857. And when that was finished, this wooden courthouse was sold, and it was moved a few feet to the east and turned into a tavern. And then during the early morning hours of July 5th, 1859, the building was consumed on a big fire along with six other buildings on the north side of the square. Again, the date being the early morning hours of July 5th, and it's believed the fire was started from fireworks. The day before Independence Day, the celebration centered around the new courthouse on the square. It was 2 years old at this time, and it was the pride of the county. And on the evening of July 4th, fireworks were set off around the square. And the courthouse nearly met the same fate as the buildings on the north side of the square later that evening. The Baraboo Republic later reported, in the evening came fireworks of several varieties. First were a few rockets and wheels, which caused great admiration. Then the courthouse roof took fire from a rocket and caused great consternation. And to his credit, Mr. Charles Wood, having seized a bucket of lemonade as being the most available fluid at the moment, made a rather perilous excursion upon the elevated slope of the building and put out the small fire, which would in a short time have wrapped this fine edifice in flames. So, of course, that fire had a little bit of an effect on people's feelings about having a fire department. Shortly thereafter, calls for a hook and ladder company were put forth, and even though the north side of the square was one of the less valuable commercial areas at that time, it was still caused over $4,500 worth of damage. And in 1860, the Baraboo Hook and Ladder Company number 1 was formed. The company marched in the 1861 Independence Day Parade the following year, and the paper at the time reported that their truck, or wagon, was 36 feet long and presented a handsome appearance. The paper also went on to say the uniforms of the company, some 60 in number, gave them a look of efficiency, which we hope may never be tried, but if it should be, we trust and believe we will be sustained by their actions. In 1861, the newly formed Hook and Ladder Company of Baraboo requested and received county and city funds for a cistern to be dug in the public square, which would be 13 by 18 feet and hold a quantity of water for fire protection purposes. Now, it seems like this first start to the Baraboo Fire Department really didn't take hold. It was kind of an on-again, off-again affair for the next 15 years. In 1863, the paper reported on the actions of the Hook and Ladder Company during a fire. Our Hook and Ladder Company, good and efficient so far as they have the means, could do but very little to arrest the progress of a fire. They cannot do a thing towards extinguishing it. They want buckets. Can they not? Shall they not be supplied? By January of 1864, the Hook and Ladder Company was seemingly inactive and almost non-existent. Now, there was some loss due to younger members joining the Union Army for the Civil War, but there also seemed to be a lack of major urgency since there weren't any major fires after 1859. So that may have lulled people into a false sense of security. But the call to action for a hook and ladder company was certainly heightened after Baraboo's next major fire in March of 1867. Now, this one occurred on the south side of the square along 3rd Avenue in an area that was called Taylor's Row. And if you'll note the two buildings marked by the arrows here at the west end of 3rd Avenue, I will show you those in a picture. You can see these are Greek Revival buildings. They were 2 of 4 buildings that were built by John Taylor in 1850 along the south side of 3rd Street. And they were spaced with a goodly distance of space between the buildings so that if one caught on fire, it would not easily communicate to the next building. And that was how they were built. There were 4 of these buildings, and as time went on, though, the spaces between them were filled in with other wooden buildings. This is Taylor's Row number 2, the second one from the corner that we just saw. It was often called headquarters for the department store that was inside. And it nearly burned down in March of 1867 when a building to the east caught fire. Took out another building, which was also housing the fledgling Sauk County Bank, and the headquarters building was saved only by vigorous snowballing and other efforts to quell the fire. It had a little bit of space in between it and the next building, and that definitely helped. The headquarters building is still with us on the square today. It, of course, is the oldest building on the square. It's from 1850. It's also the only all-wooden building left on the square for obvious reasons. It did not burn down and also was not replaced as some other wooden buildings were. So it's a rare survivor from 1850. One thing that did result, or one brick building that did result from the fire of 1867, as you remember, I mentioned the Sauk County Bank had been burned out of its wooden building where it started in 1857. And in 1867, Terrell Thomas, the president and co-founder of the bank, built a new building on the corner of Oak and 3rd Streets. This was a high-style building, certainly the finest building in Baraboo when it was built. in 1867. It was designed by E. Townsend Mix of Milwaukee, very prominent architect. This was a big deal for Baraboo. And also the brick was a big deal. This was brought in from Milwaukee with great expense from the nearest railroad, probably in Kilbourne or the Wisconsin Dells, and had to be brought by wagon load from that railroad depot there. Baraboo did not have a railroad depot for another 4 years. So we want to talk about the first major fire in 1871. Here's a picture of the square from about that time period, 1871, from the bank corner at Oak and Third, looking northwest across the square. So we see the brick courthouse in the middle of the square with the cupola hiding behind the trees. On the other side of the square, behind the flagpole, would eventually be where the Al Ringling Theater would be built, just to give you some sort of orientation. And you can see the dirt roads there and the wooden fence around the courthouse. Earlier that year, in May of 1871, there was a call in the paper to organize a hook and ladder company. MC Waite was appointed the fire warden and was instructed to take charge of the fire trucks and find, if possible, the hooks and ladders belonging to the same. So there was some equipment around, but obviously it was not all known where it was at the time. Apparently, this call to action did not seem to come to much in 1871. There was a call for members to join a hook and ladder company once again, but again, this did not seem to amount to much. 1871 was, of course, the year of the Great Chicago Fire. That summer and fall were extremely dry in the upper Midwest, and on October 8th, the Great Chicago Fire started, killing approximately 300 people, destroying roughly 3.3 square miles of the city of Chicago, and leaving more than 100,000 residents homeless. And here is a headline from the Baraboo paper. So they certainly knew what was going on, and relief aid was even sent from Baraboo to Chicago. That same evening, October 8th, the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin, which got overshadowed by the Great Chicago Fire, also occurred, burning more than 280,000 acres in 8 northeast Wisconsin counties, killing about 1,500 people. Property loss was estimated conservatively at $5 million. So really a fire to match the Great Chicago Fire. So these were on the minds of Baraboo residents in the fall of 1871. One Baraboo resident even fled Chicago during the Great Fire and took up residence in Baraboo after that. So he had firsthand knowledge. So by December of 1871, Baraboo probably thought it had escaped fire dangers of that year. But on Sunday, December 3rd, 1871, Baraboo's luck ran out when a fire started on 3rd Avenue. The paper would later report, at 12:30 on Sunday, smoke was discovered issuing from the roof of the store of Messrs. Bauer, Obert and Company on the south side of the public square. An alarm of fire was promptly given. It being but shortly after the churches were dismissed, a large crowd was more speedily congregated. The number increased at every moment until, as the fire extended, at every place where help was needed, there were men ready and willing to aid. Women, too, were there, and by their courage and efforts gave at once a noble example and effective assistance. Now, even though snow was falling that day, the fire would eventually grow to consume 7 buildings and threaten the new bank building on the corner of 3rd and Oak. Around the bank building, there was a store that had an entrance on Oak and 3rd Street, so effectively wrapping the bank building in a flammable wooden store. The Baraboo Republic reported, on the first turn of the citizens, buckets were procured. A chain of men was formed from the cistern in the rear of the hardware store to men mounted on the roofs of the buildings nearest to those on fire, and water was passed up rapidly, but with little effect in arresting the flames. Others of the citizens assisted the proprietors in removing goods from the buildings, the ladies rendering much service in this respect. The goods were stored in the street near or in the park opposite or carried to buildings out of reach of danger. Others assisted in hanging out carpets and blankets saturated with water to protect other buildings. Other people mounted the same and others mounted endangered buildings with buckets of water, using also snow to extinguish the burning fragments falling on the roofs. By the way, this picture is from the Morris Hotel fire in Lake Delton, but it shows all of the contents being deposited on the lawn near the building. Now, just to give you an idea of what these stores might contain and how packed they were, this is a picture of a typical downtown Baraboo store from years later, but would have been similar to the stores uh, going up in flames. So all of this material was moved out, and not only the goods, but once those were gone, the cases, furniture, countertops, anything that could be moved out was tried to be moved out. However, once they were out on the street, the fire danger was not past. Sometimes the goods in the street caught fire from the intensity of the flames, or things that were already on fire and were carried out lit other things on fire that were stored in the street or in the courthouse park. This was a very dramatic fire. The paper reported a nearly fatal accident here occurred. The junior proprietors, Messrs. Obert and Clavedacher, were endeavoring to get out a large counter and had worked at it until Obert was blinded with the heat and falling plastering. Warned by the settling of the roof timbers, they started for the door. Mr. Clavedacher barely escaped. Mr. Obert, blinded by, as we have said, struck against a hitching post as he ran out of the building with such force as to throw him back upon the sidewalk just as the roof and gable came crashing down, burying him in the debris. Hank Briscoe, standing near, rushed in and dragged him out. Obert's clothing was then on fire. Water was dashed over him, and he was assisted to Hofstadter's, where he is now confined to his room. Clavedacher was also severely burned and was confined to his bed until the next day evening, when he sat up to take his first meal after the fire. Obert's face is badly swollen and blackened, and half of his hair is burnt off, aside from his eyes being terribly inflamed. He is, however, improving, and last night he was able to sit up a little. A short time later, an explosion occurred in the cellar of Bauer, Obert and Company's building. It was probably a 25-pound keg of gunpowder. The paper said it did no damage, but creating some little alarm and sending up clouds of smoke, which for a brief time nearly shut out the view of the flames. The report of the explosion was as loud as that of a cannon and distinctly heard at a distance of over a mile. Now, the work of the women during this fire was notable. A Baraboo correspondent of the Watertown Republican newspaper wrote, "Never before did I see such patriotic women rushing to and fro through the mud and snow. A light snow had been falling all day. They would carry boxes and bundles that were much too heavy for their tender muscles to sustain, while young men with their clean bib and tuckers on stood gazing with an indifferent stare." All in all, 6 stores were burned. Losses were estimated at $30,000. Baraboo lost that day a grocery and drug store, boot and shoe store, a meat market, a general store, a millinery store, a dry goods store, and a jewelry store. And this is just what was in the first story of the buildings. Many of these buildings had upstairs occupants, which were burned out, including a doctor and the office for the town of Baraboo. And aside from the buildings being wholly destroyed, the cornices of the bank building and a hardware store on Oak Street were badly burned, and much damage was done to both buildings in the removal of their interior fixtures and contents. Even though the bank building was built of brick, all of the contents were removed, or much of them, just in case the building would have gone up in flames, and that did quite a bit of damage to the building and the fixtures. Now, the year 1871 was also of note in Baraboo not only for the fire, but earlier that year, in September, the railroad, the Chicago Northwestern, had finally arrived. This meant building materials were much easier and cheaper to obtain, and we'll see in a little bit that the railroad would also play a role in fighting future fires. So now, instead of bricks having to be brought by wagon from places like Kilbourne, they could be brought directly to Baraboo by rail. And in 1872, the president of the bank, who also lost a building at the back end of the bank, joined in the building efforts to create the largest grouping of connected brick buildings ever built at one time in downtown Baraboo. So here is the bank, and on the southern end, Terrell Thomas built an extension to the bank, and then beyond that, other parties built similar stores with similar windows and height for the building. This also continued around the west side of the bank on 3rd Avenue, where we see buildings of the same height with the same window sizes continuing off to the west. And as I mentioned, this was the largest collection of continuous brick buildings ever built in Wisconsin, in Baraboo, um, ever. So in 1872, nearly all of the buildings you see in this picture were built um, on 3rd Avenue. The bank is on the far left at the end of the block, and all of the new buildings continue there to the right. The bank would eventually grow and take over some of those spaces, but some of the buildings from 1872 still exist on 3rd. Some of them we know as Countryside Refined and the Tin Roof Dairy, and these are part of the aftermath of the 1871 fire. Now, apparently there were no calls for a hook and ladder company after the fire that we can find in the paper, and the next major fire would be less than a year away when fire struck again, this time on 4th Street in November of 1872. If we look a little closer at that area, we can see a number of wooden buildings on the north side of 4th Street, and just across the street to the south, rather large 3-story building with a tower on the top is the Western Hotel. This was a pioneer era hotel built in 1847 and twice enlarged to 3 stories with a cupola. It was the largest building in town. It was also the finest lodging for many years. In fact, earlier in 1872, Mary Todd Lincoln stayed at this hotel when she came to the area to see Devil's Lake. Now, the fire on 4th Street broke out in November of 1872, and the Baraboo Republic reported it as following. Baraboo has again been visited by a terrible conflagration. Last night, about 10 o'clock, flames were discovered issuing from the building owned by T.B. Quigley and occupied by Charles Sears and Company as a meat market. This is the third of a block of 7 frame buildings extending on 4th Street east from Oak. But few minutes elapsed after the alarm was sounded before the flames were bursting from the front and sides of the meat market, and owing to the furious gale which prevailed at the time, no hopes were entertained of saving any of the buildings composing the block. Every effort was immediately put forth by those present to save such property as they could and to prevent the further spread of the flames, but little time was allowed even for that. The great danger and fear was that the Western Hotel, opposite, would ignite from the intense heat and convey the fire to the business houses on the east side of the square. But by almost superhuman efforts, this latter calamity was avoided and the flames were confined to the block above named. This fire was at night at about 10 to 11 o'clock, and it was so big that the glow from it could be seen from Reedsburg. The following day, the Reedsburg Press reported that the fire could be seen, or at least the glow, all the way from Reedsburg. This time, Baraboo lost a cigar factory, a billiard hall, a dwelling, a meat market, another billiard hall and dwelling, a furniture store and factory, as well as a wagon shop and a blacksmith shop. The last building to go, the blacksmith shop, was owned by Henry Muller, and it was lined with bricks on the inside because it was a blacksmith shop, even though it was a wooden building. They were trying to keep it from catching fire from within, but ironically, it caught fire from without from the next door neighbor. After this fire, there was a call for a hook and ladder company once again. MC Waite was appointed fire warden and was instructed to find, if possible, the hooks and ladders belonging to the wagon and the hook and ladder company. And there was a call for a new hook and ladder company to be formed, but again, to no apparent response. Nevertheless, new buildings were built on 4th Street to replace those burnt out. One of the first to rebuild was Henry Muller, who was the uncle of the Ringling Brothers, and he had a carriage factory on 4th. And he built this building as a double brick building with other partners in 1873. And here's another view of that same street with the Muller Wagon Works in the foreground. Note the ramp and stairs to the 2nd floor where the carriages were finished off and then brought down to street level. In the background, going up the street on the left at the corner, we see the Gust Brothers Meat Market. This is now the Cornerstone Gallery. And just across the street from that is the Sumner House, which was built in 1878 as a storefronts on the 1st floor and a hotel on the 2nd floor. And this was now to replace the Western Hotel as the finer place to stay. The Sumner House would eventually become the Warren Hotel after a 3rd floor was added to the building. It'd take a few more years before the entire block was built up again, but here we see the Henry Muller Wagon Works building a few years back. And looking down the street from the other direction, we have the Goose Brothers Meat Market on the corner. In this picture, now known as the Baraboo Savings Bank, and today we know it as the Cornerstone Gallery. And the fine building to the right of that, kind of finishing up the block, was built in 1886, and most of those buildings are still in situ today. So the Western Hotel was spared during that fire of 1872, but it was only 6 more years before the next fire struck on the east side of the square along the 500 block of Oak Street. And again, the Western Hotel anchored the north end of that block. On the southern end of the block at the corner of 3rd and Oak was originally built the earliest frame building in Baraboo. So this was one of the most desirable blocks in the downtown area, and it was chock full of buildings right next to each other. Again, this is what the Western Hotel looked like. It was now less desirable to stay at since the new Sumner Hotel was built kitty corner across the street. And this would now succumb to fire in 1878. The paper reported in November of 1878, November 6th, between 7 and 8 o'clock this morning, a fire broke out on Oak Street between 3rd and 4th in the business block occupying the east side of the public square. The fire originated under the roof and about the chimney in Sumner's building. A carpenter had built a fire in a large stove on the 1st floor, he being about to make some repairs upon the building. It originated in the middle of the block in a building owned by Charles Sumner, and a few minutes after it was discovered, broke out at the roof, and then for want of fire apparatus became unmanageable. The wind conveyed the flames southerly to other buildings in the block, and the heat was so intense as to cause the fire to back up against the wind and to take out the buildings to the north. Fansteel's Bakery, next north of Sumner's building, was the second to take fire, and Gattaker's building across the alley to the south, third. The Western Hotel, occupying the north end of the block, took fire from Fansteel's. The fire continued to the south of the block, and it would have continued, except that the crowd tore down 2 buildings in the path of the fire to create a fire break before it reached the corner. The newspaper at the time continued to say the fire occurred at a time of day when everybody was stirring, and the scene was soon crowded with hardworking men and women from all parts of the town. Nearly all the personal property, furniture, and stock of goods were carried to places of safety, mostly into the courthouse park on the opposite side of Oak Street. "40 years later, Mrs. Mary Platt recalled, when the flames reached a saloon on Oak Street, all the bystanders ran into the building to help carry out the liquor. The liquor was deposited in the courtyard, and it wasn't long until the men who weren't fighting the fire began to steal it." She also reported that her husband, Louis Platt, had a harness shop and had practically all of his stock of goods stolen, even though his building was not burned up in the fire. The newspaper continued to say, it is curious, but every firm burnt out misses a good many articles of small and portable kind. If any person should find anything in his overcoat pocket that he doesn't recognize as having belonged to him previous to the fire, nor as purchased since, it would be well enough to give it thoughtful consideration. So a lot of small objects disappeared during these fires when the buildings were emptied. The paper continued, there was a fine spirit manifested by men, women, and children who rallied to the saving of property. It seemed as if all the men in town and nearly all the women were present, and noble work was done. In the hurry of getting to press this morning, we are unable to specially mention many who are deserving of praise in this connection. At one point, the cupola of the courthouse was on fire from a flying brand, and there was seen a brave rush of men to the rescue. Ladders came from all quarters, and simultaneously men reached the fire from both the inside and outside of the cupola roof, and the building was saved. The burning of the entire row on Oak Street did not occupy more than 2 hours. So intense was the heat engendered and the high wind raised. The railroad did play a large part in quelling fires now that there was a railroad to Baraboo and there was other equipment in nearby communities that could be accessed. The paper reported at the time, we probably have to get a fire engine here if it were not for having the Northwestern Railroad. No sooner does this town begin to burn than Superintendent Swineford stops all business on the line and goes to hauling in the fire departments of Madison and Reedsburg. What makes our insurance so low and gives such a sense of security to property owners is the circumstance that there are fire engines at Reedsburg and Madison that can be had by telegraphing. The railroad employees covered themselves with glory at the fire. There wasn't anyone left around the depot, offices, or shops except the telegraph operator, and of course he had to stay there and send for our fire apparatus to Madison and Reedsburg. So Baraboo was kind of freeloading off of Reedsburg and Madison at the time, not having its own proper equipment. Reedsburg in October of 1873 had purchased a Babcock fire apparatus at the cost of $650 for a complete outfit consisting of the truck or wagon, 4 6-gallon extinguishers, 12 chemical charges in each of those, 4 ladders, which amounted to 68 feet in length, 10 fire buckets, 2 axes, 2 pike poles, 1 hook and chain, 5 lanterns, and 60 feet of drag rope. And the Babcock Hook and Ladder Company number 1 of Reedsburg was organized in June of 1877, or 1873 rather, and in 1877 a hand engine was purchased from the city of Fond du Lac for $350. So Reedsburg had some good equipment which could be brought to Baraboo by the railroad. Now the state of affairs in Baraboo was not lost on the paper. It's stated in the Baraboo News Republic, if the boys had not succeeded in raising Ryan's building, and the last one in the block had taken fire, and that train with the Reedsburg Fire Company had been ditched this side of North Freedom, then what? The state of affairs and the lack of the fire department was also brought to light the following year during the 4th of July parade. At 9 a.m., the fire department and ragamuffins paraded. The travesty was excellent and ludicrous in the extreme. The takeoff on the fire department was as full of humor as could be. When a fire occurs in Baraboo, every man and woman runs with a pail or a step ladder or a dipper, anything likely to be useful as an extinguisher, and this constitutes our fire department. There is an old hook and ladder truck to be sure, but it amounts to nothing, and so it was made the basis of the display on the 4th. Now, the village had grown to the point that the village board was starting to sit up and take notice that the lack of the fire department was a real problem at this point. They were considering buying a building on 4th Street to house their village board on the 2nd floor and put the hook and ladder truck, as it were, in the bottom of that building as it apparently was sitting out in the open. But the situation really didn't improve, and by April of 1880, Mr. C. Barch took out an article in the paper and tried to rally the public support by stating that he would chip in $5 himself for new equipment and asked others to join him. The call was apparently not heeded for a couple more years. Now, after the fire on Oak Street and the 500 block new buildings went up, it would take a few years, however, before the entire block became whole again. In 1881, work began on the Wright block, which was built for Elizabeth Steele Wright from Prairie to Sac. She, unfortunately, was the last uninsured owner of the Western Hotel, which used to sit on this corner. But somehow she scraped enough money together to build one of the larger buildings in downtown that had three storefronts on the front and one around the corner on Fourth. The building still exists today as Oak Street Antiques and Amber Moon Floral, and the Wright name can still be seen at the top of the building. Other buildings in the block were built years following, and by the mid 1880s, Oak Street was once again a row of complete buildings, this time 2 stories and made out of brick, presenting a fine appearance on the east side of the square. The 1878 fire on Oak Street was perhaps the granddaddy of all the downtown fires. It certainly was the biggest. It almost took out the entire block. Fires after that were slightly smaller, but the next fire would occur just a few months later, further south on Oak Street at the corner of 3rd and Oak, this time consuming the building at the corner, which was a large wooden building owned by Dr. B.F. Mills. It's where the corner drugstore started, the same corner drugstore that we know today, and just to the south of it, another building as well. Here's a rare photo of the back of the Wooden Mills building on the left. And on the right side, you should recognize the Ohio store that we saw earlier. And both of these buildings were consumed in the 1880 fire. So the Baraboo News Republic reported on April 13th, 1880, at 8 o'clock last night, a fire broke out in the east end of the Mills wooden block, southeast corner of Oak and 3rd Streets, in apartments occupied by the family of Joseph Udell. Mrs. Udell discovered a spark on the carpet and extinguished it, as she supposed. After this, she had occasion to leave the building for a while, and on returning found the room in flames. Owing to the lack of any firefighting equipment and the presence of a high wind, the building was of course doomed, and the efforts of the assembled crowd were directed to saving the contents, which was mostly effected without unavoidable destruction of them. The fire was the hottest that anyone ever saw, made from so small a mass of combustibles. At times, the bank, which was across the street, was endangered. The new Burrington block had a narrow escape as well, the casings and sashes being burned, glass broken, etc. Only by the most strenuous efforts was it saved. The fire backed up against the wind to Train's building in the lot next but one south, and that was also wholly consumed. The brick building adjoining this one on the south and occupied by Brewer's Billiard Hall was slightly damaged by the burning of the window frames and sashes and the destruction of glass. So this time the loss, slightly smaller, included places of business for a druggist, a dentist, 2 barbers, harness maker, an express agent, confectioner, and a billiard hall and dressmaker, as well as the apartments of the unfortunate Udell family. Later that year in 1880, construction started on a new building that Dr. Mills built at the corner of 3rd and Oak, which would house the corner drug for many years. And again, still the same corner drug that we know, just moved down the street. Dr. Mills also built the building to the left, another fine brick building, and eventually more buildings were built to the south of the Mills brick building to complete what had been lost in the fire. And we know those buildings today as the jewelry store and Nito's Bakery on Oak Street. Once again, however, it would still be a few more years before Baraboo got serious about a real hook and ladder company. In February of 1883, a meeting was called at the courthouse once again, but this time 2 sentences in the article stand out, and they are, "The City Council will be present in a body. All the members of the council feel a living interest in the safety and welfare of our city." So this time there was buy-in by the city of Baraboo, and not only figuratively, but literally, as money was appropriated to buy new firefighting equipment, just like Reedsburg from the Babcock Fire Extinguisher Company. By April of 1883, Baraboo had a new Babcock chemical fire engine with all of the bells and whistles. And it would be used in the next fire, which again happened on Oak Street, marching south to continue the block. Down at the south end of the 400 block of Oak Street, the Baraboo Republic reported on Sunday, October 12, 1884. At about 1:30 in the morning, the people of the city were aroused by the ringing of a fire alarm bell and the cry of fire. It was found that the wooden structures on Oak Street, north of the stone feed store building, were on fire. The buildings, being very old, burned rapidly and were soon consumed. The fire originated in the building owned by P. Pratt. Recently, it was occupied by Mrs. Johnson as a laundry. Mrs. Johnson moved out the day previous, and it is said she left a fire in the stove, which is supposed to have been the cause of the conflagration. From this building, the fire communicated to William Powers Taylor's shop on the north, and the building south, owned by Dr. Caserta, known as the Butler Building. And from there, it went spread to the old Sam Hartley post office building on the corner of Oak and 2nd Streets. This time, the relatively recently formed Hook and Ladder Company was mentioned in the paper as coming to the fire, but unable to do much to stop the spread of the flames. And once again, the block was rebuilt in brick, and the south half of the 400 block of Oak Street today is filled with brick buildings that we know to the present. The last fire we want to talk about tonight, and the last major fire downtown before there was a real modern fire department, occurred in 1886 on 3rd Street. Really some of the last wooden buildings left to be had in downtown Baraboo. And on March 4th, 1886, the fire occurred. The Baraboo Republic reported the following. Between the hours of 10 and 11 o'clock, the people of Baraboo were warned by the clang of the fire department bell that fire threatened the safety of our city. The wooden structures on the north side of 3rd Street, owned by Louis Wild and occupied by the millinery store of Mrs. Charles Wild, and the confectionery factory and store of A.B. Willett, was discovered to be on fire. The City Hook and Ladder Company promptly responded to the call, and the people gathered from all quarters of the city. Everything possible was done to save the property from destruction, all working with a will. The fire soon communicated to the adjoining building west, a few feet distant from the Wild building owned by Mr. A. Tousley and occupied by himself and his wife as a dwelling and millinery store. Both of these buildings were totally destroyed, together with a portion of their contents. Many of the goods saved were badly damaged by being moved in such haste. The Schoenfeld building, which adjoined the Wild building on the east, was by strenuous efforts saved, though badly damaged by the fire. And once again, brick buildings were built to replace those. The Tousley block was constructed in 1886, houses a very recognizable establishment today, Becca Cates, and you see the date there on the top of the building, 1886, which was a seminal year for construction of brick buildings in downtown Baraboo. More than a dozen storefronts were put up that year alone around the square. So in the space of just 15 years, Baraboo grew from a sleepy little village in 1870 to a much bigger city by 1886. We're fortunate to have two Baraboo bird's eye drawings for the city, one from 1870 and this one from 1886, which shows the remarkable growth of the city, largely brought about by the arrival of the railroad. And it's those 2 years that kind of bookend our talk tonight, and the 6 fires that took us from the bucket brigade era to more of the modern city that we know today. One thing that did happen in 1886 as well was the installation of the first municipal water system in Baraboo. And the water tank for that original waterworks was built on the north side of town at the top of Birch Street on Cheeks Hill. If we zoom in on that, you can see it a little better. The waterworks were started in the fall of 1886 and completed in the spring of 1887 at a cost of $75,000. Water was obtained from springs near the Manchester Street area and then pumped by other water power up to the hill at the top of Birch Street and put into the water tank there. The tank is 52 feet high and 30 feet in diameter and has a capacity of 150 gallons. And I do use the present tense because the tank still exists today at the top of Birch Street. And as far as we know, it is the oldest water tank in use by a municipality in the entire state of Wisconsin and still serves Baraboo proudly as a reminder of the 1886 era and the coming of modern fire hydrants and better firefighting techniques in Baraboo.